At a bustling park on a sunny afternoon, Chantel, a sharp-witted, socially conscious woman, locks eyes with an elderly veteran named Walter as he rises to salute during the national anthem. Her sarcastic chuckle sparks a debate that quickly turns into a public spectacle. But what starts as a clash of perspectives soon spirals into a surprising journey, revealing secrets, bridging divides, and leaving everyone with a lesson they never expected. Chantel, a young activist with a knack for making sharp quips, finds herself at a public event where Walter, a stoic Vietnam War veteran, stands proudly for the anthem. Her laughter interrupts the serene moment, catching the attention of nearby onlookers. Chantel's critique of blind patriotism collides with Walter's deeply personal reasons for honoring the anthem, setting the stage for a heated exchange. Chapter 2. The Debate. The argument between Chantel and Walter escalates, drawing a curious crowd. Chantel, with her sharp tongue and modern ideals, challenges Walter's traditional values. Walter counters with his war stories, painting a vivid picture of sacrifice and honor. Their clash, though comedic at moments, reveals the generational and cultural divide between them. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Ally. Enter Carmen, a street performer who overhears the debate and jumps in with her own perspective. Her comedic yet insightful remarks diffuse the tension and force both Chantel and Walter to reconsider their stances. Carmen suggests a public challenge, for Chantel to spend a day walking in Walter's shoes, literally wearing his old army boots, to understand his journey. Chapter 4. A Day in the Boots. Reluctantly, Chantel accepts the challenge, trading her trendy sneakers for Walter's worn boots. As she retraces parts of his life, including visiting a veteran's shelter and hearing stories of resilience and loss, she begins to see the anthem not as blind patriotism, but as a symbol of hope and survival for people like Walter. Chapter 5. Walter's Revelation. While Chantel learns about Walter's sacrifices, Walter himself begins to reflect on Chantel's criticisms of modern America. He attends one of her community rallies and gains a deeper appreciation for her fight for equality and justice. Both come to realize that their values, though different, are rooted in the same desire for a better future. Chapter 6. The Anthem Reimagined. At the next public event, Chantel and Walter stand together during the anthem. This time, Chantel doesn't laugh. Instead, she sings the anthem alongside Walter, but with her own twist, adding a verse about unity and progress. The crowd, moved by their journey, joins in. The moment becomes a viral sensation, sparking conversations nationwide about bridging generational and ideological gaps. The bustling park was alive with activity on a sunny Saturday. Parents herded their children toward ice cream trucks, lovers strolled hand in hand, and joggers darted past groups of elderly chess players hunched over their boards. A golden retriever barked excitedly at a squirrel darting up a tree, while a street musician strummed gentle chords on a guitar near the fountain. At the heart of it all, a makeshift stage stood proudly, draped in slightly faded flags and playing patriotic tunes through an old but determined speaker. Leaning against a tree a few yards away was Chantel Williams, a young activist with a sharp tongue and an even sharper wit. She was dressed in a bright crop top, ripped jeans, and sneakers adorned with hand-painted slogans like "Dissent is patriotism" and "Equality now." Chantel was well known in her circles for sparking debates online and off. Her afro was perfectly styled, and her dangling earrings bore small signs that read, "Freedom for all." She scrolled through her phone, laughing softly at a cat meme. Social media was her battlefield, and memes were her weapon of choice. As the music transitioned to the national anthem, a hush fell over most of the park. People stood instinctively, placing their hands over their hearts. A mother nudged her distracted son and whispered, "Show some respect." Even the street musician stopped playing and turned solemnly toward the flag. Yet Chantel remained glued to her phone, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. A chuckle escaped her lips, soft but loud enough to be noticed by Walter Thompson. Walter, a Vietnam War veteran in his late 70s, stood a few feet away. His meticulously preserved military jacket, adorned with medals, told the story of a life spent in service. His slightly hunched frame and cane hinted at the toll those years had taken. Yet his piercing blue eyes remained sharp, scanning the crowd with the intensity of someone who had seen far too much of the world. Hearing Chantel's laugh, he turned toward her, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Something funny, young lady?" he asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. The few people nearby turned to see who he was addressing. Chantel, caught off guard, looked up from her phone. Her gaze met Walter's, and for a moment she was speechless. "Oh, no, it's not that," she stammered, holding up her phone as if to defend herself. "It's just this meme. It's hilarious. A cat trying to open a jar." She trailed off, realizing too late that this explanation was unlikely to appease the elderly man. Walter's gaze hardened. "Back in my day," he said, his tone heavy with disapproval, "we didn't laugh during the anthem. We stood up, we saluted, we respected what it stood for." Chantel raised an eyebrow, her initial embarrassment giving way to defiance. "With all due respect, sir," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket, "standing doesn't fix the problems in this country. Some of us prefer to speak out rather than stand up." The tension between them was palpable, thickening the air around them. A few bystanders stopped to watch, sensing that a confrontation was brewing. Parents hushed their children, and even the chess players paused their game to listen. Walter took a step closer, leaning on his cane for support. "You think you know what it means to speak out?" he asked, his voice growing firmer. "I bled for this country, for your right to stand here and mock it." Chantel crossed her arms, her confidence growing. "And I appreciate that. I really do. But patriotism isn't about saluting a flag or standing for a song. It's about making sure this country lives up to the ideals you fought for." The crowd around them grew larger, drawn in by the passionate exchange. A teenager pulled out his phone and began live-streaming the debate, narrating for his followers, "Yo, this is wild. Old school vet versus woke activist. Who y'all got?" Walter launched into stories of his time in Vietnam, of crawling through jungles, dodging enemy fire, and losing friends in battle. "I didn't fight for a perfect country," he admitted. "I fought for the people in it, for their freedom, for their future, even for people like you, who take it for granted." Chantel listened, her expression softening slightly. "I'm not taking it for granted," she countered. "I'm fighting for a future where people like me don't have to fight to be seen, to be heard, to be safe." Their words carried weight, but there were moments of levity that broke the tension. When Walter mentioned crawling through jungles, Chantel quipped, "Well, I've braved Black Friday sales. Pretty sure it's the same thing." The crowd burst into laughter, and even Walter allowed a small smile to crack his otherwise stern demeanor. By the time the anthem ended, their argument had drawn a sizable audience. People clapped, not for the debate's winner, but for the raw honesty both had shown. Walter sighed, leaning more heavily on his cane. "You're a firecracker, I'll give you that," he said, his tone softer now. Chantel grinned. "And you're tougher than you look, old man." She extended her hand. "Maybe next time we'll find some common ground." Walter hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. "Maybe," he replied. As the crowd dispersed, neither realized their clash would spark a journey that would change them both. The tension in the park dissipated as the crowd dispersed, but the conversation between Chantel and Walter lingered in the air. Walter, still leaning on his cane, watched Chantel as she walked away, her phone already back in hand. The encounter had unsettled him, not because of her defiance, but because her words had struck a chord, one he wasn't entirely ready to acknowledge. Chantel, for her part, felt a similar unease. She had faced down plenty of critics before, but something about Walter's stern yet earnest demeanor stayed with her. Later that evening, Chantel found herself scrolling through the live stream video of their argument, which had gone viral. Comments flooded the screen. "Respect the vet." She has a point, though. This is the problem with these woke kids. The polarized responses didn't surprise her, but one comment stuck out. Maybe if they walked in each other's shoes, they'd understand better. The words played in her mind as she paced her small apartment, filled with posters of social justice icons and stacks of books on activism. She wasn't used to second-guessing herself, but something about Walter's story, the loss, the sacrifice, made her wonder if she had been too dismissive. She grabbed her notebook and scribbled a thought. Patriotism versus progress. Can they coexist? Meanwhile, Walter sat in his quiet home, a small but neatly kept bungalow adorned with pictures of his late wife and children. His military jacket, now neatly hung, rested on a chair. On his coffee table sat a stack of letters from fellow veterans and a half-empty glass of bourbon. He rarely engaged in debates, especially public ones, but Chantel's fiery determination had sparked something in him. Turning on the TV, he was met with news coverage of their confrontation, framing it as a clash between traditional values and modern activism. He turned it off with a grunt, muttering to himself, "She doesn't know what she's talking about." The next day, both Chantel and Walter found themselves drawn back to the park. Chantel had planned to meet a friend for coffee, but when she passed the same tree she had leaned against the day before, she paused. Walter, who had come to the park for his morning walk, spotted her and hesitated. For a moment, neither moved, unsure whether to acknowledge the other. Chantel broke the silence. "You back to lecture more millennials, or is this your usual route?" she asked, her tone light but guarded. Walter smirked, tapping his cane on the ground. "This park's been my usual route since before you were born. What brings you here? Another meme convention?" Chantel couldn't help but laugh, despite herself. "Touché. No, I'm just grabbing coffee. You?" "Clearing my head," Walter said simply. He gestured to a nearby bench. "You got a minute?" Chantel hesitated but nodded, following him to the bench. As they sat, Walter glanced at her. "I saw that video. The one the kid posted. You made quite the impression." "You're not exactly anonymous yourself," Chantel replied. "Looks like we're both the talk of the internet." Walter chuckled, a deep, raspy sound. "Not sure how I feel about that. Never been one for the spotlight." "Neither have I," Chantel admitted, "but here we are." For the first time, their conversation lacked the edge of the day before. Instead of trading barbs, they asked questions. Walter spoke more about his time in Vietnam, the camaraderie, the fear, and the pain of losing friends. Chantel listened intently, her usual quick retorts replaced by thoughtful silence. In return, she shared her experiences growing up as a black woman in America, fighting for change in a world that often dismissed her voice. She spoke of marches she had organized, the backlash she had faced, and the hope she clung to for a better future. "I guess we're both fighting for something," Chantel said eventually, breaking a pause. "We just see it differently." Walter nodded. "Or maybe we're just fighting for different sides of the same coin." Their conversation stretched on, covering history, culture, and their personal experiences. Walter was surprised to learn that Chantel admired figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, while Chantel was intrigued by Walter's love of jazz and classic literature. Despite their differences, they found common ground in their shared respect for storytelling and determination. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Walter leaned back on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "you remind me of my granddaughter. She's about your age, just as fiery." Chantel smiled. "She sounds smart." "She is," Walter said, his tone softening. "But she's stubborn, just like you." Chantel laughed. "Guess it runs in the generation." Walter looked at her, his gaze steady. "Maybe it's not about generations. Maybe it's about finding a way to bridge the gap." Chantel nodded, her smile fading into a more serious expression. Maybe. As they stood to leave, Walter extended a hand. For what it's worth, I respect your passion, even if I don't always agree with it. Chantel shook his hand firmly. Right back at you. They parted ways, both feeling a little lighter than they had the day before. Neither of them knew what would come next, but for the first time, they felt the possibility of understanding, and maybe even change. The following week, Chantel and Walter's lives continued to intersect in unexpected ways. Chantel, curious and still grappling with the lingering effects of their exchange, began researching topics she hadn't considered before. The sacrifices of veterans, the struggles they faced returning home, and systemic failures in their treatment. For someone who prided herself on being informed, she was surprised at how much she didn't know. Walter, on the other hand, started looking into modern activism. He'd expected to find shallow slogans and chaos, but as he watched videos of peaceful marches and read young leaders' opinion pieces, he found himself intrigued. Though he wouldn't admit it, some arguments resonated more than he'd anticipated. Their next meeting at the park felt inevitable. Chantel brought a book on civil rights movements, planning to read under the same tree where they'd first met. Walter, seeking solace after a frustrating visit to the VA hospital, noticed her sitting on the bench. You don't seem like the sitting, quietly reading type, Walter teased, nodding toward the book in her hands. And you don't seem like someone who chats casually with millennials, Chantel replied, closing the book. Touché, Walter said, easing onto the bench beside her. What are you reading? Marching to Freedom, Stories from the Civil Rights Movement, she said, holding the book up for him to see. Walter nodded appreciatively. Good choice. I actually met John Lewis once, one of the bravest men I ever knew. Chantel's eyes widened, her jaw slightly dropping. You met John Lewis? Seriously? Walter chuckled, clearly enjoying her reaction. It was at a fundraiser for veterans housing. He spoke about how the fight for freedom doesn't end with one victory. It's a battle you keep fighting. That man had a way with words. Chantel stared at him in awe. And here I thought you were just some grumpy old guy with a cane. Walter laughed, a hearty sound that caught even him off guard. I contain multitudes, he said, quoting Whitman, though I suspect you're not as one-dimensional as you like to pretend. Chantel grinned, leaning back against the bench. Fair point. That afternoon, their conversation shifted from history to politics to their personal lives. Walter shared more stories about his time in Vietnam, not just the battles but the friendships, the laughter, and the fleeting moments of humanity amidst the chaos. Chantel listened intently, her phone forgotten for once. In return, she opened up about her family and upbringing. She told him how her parents had instilled in her a sense of justice and the importance of standing up for what's right. Her father had participated in protests during the 1980s, and her mother always reminded her, you don't just inherit the world, you help shape it. I guess that's why I'm so passionate, Chantel admitted. It's not just about me. It's about the next generation. It's about leaving things better than we found them. Walter nodded thoughtfully. That sounds a lot like why I enlisted. It wasn't just about defending the country. It was about protecting the people in it, making sure the future was worth fighting for. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. Around them, the park buzzed with chatter, children's laughter, and the hum of activity, but their little corner felt calm, almost sacred. You know, Walter said after a long pause, I don't agree with everything you say, but I respect how deeply you believe in it. Same, Chantel replied. I think some of your views are outdated, but I get where they're coming from now. Walter smirked. Outdated, huh? Well, you are old, Chantel teased, her grin widening. Walter chuckled again. Fair enough, but don't think I'm too old to learn. People like you remind me there's always more to understand. Chantel was moved by his words, more than she expected. Same goes for you. You've got a perspective I don't have, and I think I've been too quick to dismiss people like you. That's on me." Walter's expression turned serious. "The truth is, we need both. The fighters and the dreamers. The ones who've been through it and the ones pushing for change. If we can't find a way to work together, we're all just spinning our wheels." Chantel nodded. "Yeah, you're right." As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, they stood to leave. Before parting, Walter extended his hand. "For what it's worth, I respect your passion, even if I don't always agree with it." Chantel shook his hand firmly. "Right back at you." They walked away in opposite directions, but both felt a little lighter than they had in days. Chantel reflected on Walter's words as she walked home, thinking about how progress wasn't always a straight line and how the world wasn't black and white. Maybe, just maybe, the only way forward was together. Walter, back at his bungalow, hung up his jacket and smiled as he thought about Chantel's relentless energy and sharp mind. He didn't know where these conversations would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Walter sat in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee growing cold on the side table. Spread before him were photos and letters from his old squad. Some were faded, others carefully preserved. They were fragments of his past, pieces he hadn't shared in years. But after his conversations with Chantel, he found himself revisiting these memories with a new sense of purpose. Chantel, meanwhile, sat in her apartment staring at a blank Word document. Her blog had always been her outlet, but this time she struggled to find the right words. Writing about Walter felt more personal than anything she'd done before. She typed, "Bridging the divide," then stared at the screen, unsure how to continue. Both were processing the same realization. Their conversations were changing them, challenging beliefs they'd held for years, and neither of them could shake the feeling that their dialogue was far from over. A few days later, Walter received a call from the community center. They were hosting a veterans panel and someone had suggested him as a speaker. Public speaking wasn't his thing, but inspired by Chantel's passion, he agreed. "If she can do it, so can I," he muttered. Chantel, on the other hand, was preparing for a youth rally. As she worked on her speech, she found herself thinking of Walter. His perspective gave her a new lens, a way to connect with people she might have overlooked before. When they bumped into each other at the park, it felt almost planned. "Back again?" Chantel teased, adjusting the strap of her messenger bag. "I could say the same," Walter replied. "What's your excuse this time?" "Meeting ran late. You?" "Clearing my head before a panel tomorrow," Walter said. "A panel?" Chantel asked, intrigued. "They want me to talk about my experiences as a veteran," he explained. "Not really my thing, but it's time to share my story." Chantel nodded. "I think people need to hear from you." Walter raised an eyebrow. "What about you? Any speeches lined up?" "Saturday," Chantel said. "A rally on youth activism." Walter chuckled. "Let me guess, telling everyone to burn it all down?" Chantel laughed. "Not this time. Trying something new, less shouting, more listening." "I'd like to see that," Walter said. "How about a trade? I'll come to your rally if you come to my panel." Chantel thought for a moment before nodding. "Deal." The panel took place in a modest room at the community center. Walter arrived early, wearing a crisp shirt and slacks. As the room filled, his nerves grew. But when it was his turn to speak, he steadied himself. Walter's voice was calm but firm as he shared his journey. Enlisting as a hopeful young man, the harsh realities of war, and the struggles of returning home. He spoke of the friends he'd lost and the hope he found in younger generations. "We've seen the worst of humanity," Walter said, "but we've also seen the best. It's up to us to make sure the next generation sees more of the latter." Chantel, sitting in the back, was moved by his words. When the panel ended, she waited as Walter answered questions. When he finally saw her, he smiled. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I wouldn't miss it," Chantel said. "You were amazing." Walter scoffed. "Don't exaggerate." "I'm not," Chantel insisted. "You spoke your truth. That's powerful." Walter nodded, touched. "Your turn next." The rally was lively and colorful, held in the park. Chantel stood at the microphone, addressing a crowd of students, activists, and families. Walter stood near the back, arms crossed, listening intently. Chantel's speech was passionate but measured. "Progress doesn't happen in a vacuum," she said. "It happens when we listen, when we learn, and when we work together." Walter nodded along, seeing the world through her eyes. Afterward, they met near the edge of the crowd. "Well?" Chantel asked. "You've got a way with words," Walter said. "Might even rival John Lewis." Chantel laughed. "High praise." Walter smiled. "You're making me see things differently." "Right back at you," Chantel said. As they walked out of the park together, they realized something unexpected. They weren't just learning from each other. They were changing each other. After the rally, Chantel and Walter met more often. Their conversations grew deeper, more honest. It wasn't just about debates, it was about understanding. Chantel began to see Walter as more than a veteran clinging to old ideals. He was someone who had fought for what he believed in. Walter, in turn, began to see Chantel as more than a brash activist. She was a visionary, fighting for justice in a flawed world. One afternoon, as they sat on their usual park bench, Walter sighed and gripped his cane. "You know, there's something I've never told anyone," he began, his voice quiet. Chantel turned to him, surprised. "What is it?" Walter hesitated. "I don't always feel proud of the things I've done. There were moments in Vietnam. Choices we made. I wonder if they did more harm than good." Chantel placed a hand on his arm. "You did what you thought was right at the time. None of us are perfect." Walter nodded but kept his eyes on the ground. "It's not just the war. It's everything after. Coming back to a country that didn't want us, losing friends to addiction and depression. Sometimes, I wonder if I did enough to help them." Chantel was quiet for a moment. "You're helping now. Talking to me, sharing your story. It matters." Walter gave a small smile. "Thanks, kid. I needed to hear that." Chantel leaned back, staring at the sky. "You know, I've been thinking about how quick I've been to judge people like you. I used to think older generations just didn't get it, that they were stuck in their ways. But you've shown me how wrong I was." Walter raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought millennials didn't admit when they were wrong." Chantel laughed. "Don't get used to it. But seriously, you've shown me that progress isn't just about pushing forward. It's about bringing people along with you." For a while, they sat in silence, watching the world around them. A group of children played tag nearby, their laughter echoing in the breeze. A dog chased a squirrel up a tree as its owner called out half-heartedly. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "What's next for you?" Chantel shrugged. "I'm thinking about a new project, something that bridges gaps instead of widening them." Walter nodded. "That's good. The world needs more of that." "What about you?" Chantel asked. "Any big plans?" Walter chuckled. "At my age, one day at a time. But maybe I'll keep speaking at panels, write down some stories. Who knows? Maybe they'll help someone." "They will," Chantel said. "You've got a lot to say, Walter. People need to hear it." Their unlikely friendship deepened over the weeks. They began attending each other's events. Chantel introduced Walter to her activist friends, who were initially skeptical of the old veteran, but quickly warmed to his wisdom and humor. Walter brought Chantel to veterans' gatherings where she listened intently to their stories and shared her perspective. At one gathering, a young veteran named Jake approached Chantel after hearing her speak. "I didn't think I had much in common with activists," he admitted, "but you've made me think differently. Maybe we're all fighting the same fight, just from different angles." Chantel smiled. Exactly. It's not about sides. It's about the goal. Walter, overhearing the conversation, felt a swell of pride. He'd always believed in the power of connection, but seeing it play out was something else entirely. Their collaboration didn't stop there. Chantel and Walter began planning a joint event, a forum where activists and veterans could share stories and find common ground. It was Chantel's idea, but Walter embraced it. "If we can get people talking," he said, "maybe we can start healing these divides." The forum was scheduled for a Saturday in the same park where their friendship began. As the day approached, both felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Would people show up? Would the conversation be productive? When the day arrived, the park buzzed with energy. Dozens of people gathered under a large tent, curious about the event. Walter, dressed in his military jacket, greeted attendees with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Chantel moved between tables, checking on volunteers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. The forum began with Walter and Chantel sharing their story, how they met, the debates they'd had, and the lessons they'd learned. Their honesty and humor set the tone, breaking down walls before anyone could build them. From there, the microphone was passed around. Veterans spoke about sacrifices and struggles. Activists shared dreams of change and challenges they faced. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest, and that was what mattered. By the end of the day, it was clear the event had been a success. People who arrived as strangers left as allies. Their perspectives broadened and their hearts a little more open. As the sun set and the park emptied, Walter and Chantel sat on their bench, exhausted but content. "We did good today," Walter said. "We did," Chantel agreed, "but this is just the beginning." Walter smiled. "It always is." The months after the forum brought greater changes to both Chantel and Walter than they had anticipated. What started as a simple event to connect two groups had sparked a ripple effect across their community and beyond. News of the forum reached local media outlets, and soon, larger organizations began contacting Chantel and Walter, eager to replicate the model. The idea of bridging divides through shared stories resonated with many, and suddenly, the unlikely duo found themselves at the center of a movement. Chantel was inundated with emails and calls from activists, community leaders, and even politicians, all seeking advice. Walter, meanwhile, began receiving invitations from veterans organizations, high schools, and colleges, asking him to share his experiences. For two people who had never sought the spotlight, the sudden attention was overwhelming but deeply rewarding. One day, they received an invitation to speak at a regional conference focused on unity and social progress. Held at a large civic center, the event promised to draw hundreds of attendees. Chantel was thrilled but nervous. Walter, ever the steady presence, reassured her. "We've done this before," he said with a grin. "This is just a bigger audience." When the day arrived, the civic center buzzed with energy. Backstage, Chantel paced nervously, her hands fidgeting with her notes. Walter, leaning on his cane, watched her with quiet amusement. "You've given a million speeches," Walter said. "What's got you so worked up?" Chantel paused, her brow furrowed. "This feels different. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everything we've built." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. It is different. And that's a good thing. It means it matters." Their turn came, and they stepped onto the stage to a wave of applause. The crowd, a diverse mix of activists, veterans, students, and community leaders, fell silent as they began to speak. They shared their story, recounting the chance meeting in the park, the debates that had challenged their beliefs, and the friendship that had grown from it. They spoke of the power of listening, the importance of finding common ground, and the necessity of working together despite differences. Their words, filled with honesty, humor, and vulnerability, struck a chord with the audience. Chantel's voice trembled slightly as she addressed the crowd. "For a long time, I thought progress was a straight line, that if you pushed hard enough, everyone would catch up. But Walter taught me progress doesn't happen unless you bring people with you. It's not just about fighting. It's about connecting." Walter added, "Chantel taught me that just because you've lived a long life doesn't mean you stop learning. The world changes, and if you're not willing to change with it, you get left behind." She reminded me, it's never too late to grow. Their words were met with a standing ovation, the applause echoing through the massive hall. Chantel and Walter exchanged a glance, both stunned and deeply moved. After the conference, attendees lined up to speak with them. People shared their own stories, expressed gratitude, and asked questions. Chantel and Walter stayed late into the evening, talking to as many as they could. By the time they left, they were exhausted but fulfilled, their hearts full of hope. In the weeks that followed, their lives continued to evolve. Walter finally began writing his stories, encouraged by Chantel's constant reminders that they needed to be told. Chantel, inspired by Walter's humility and wisdom, launched a new initiative focused on intergenerational dialogue. Her goal was to create spaces where people from different generations could come together to share and learn. Not everyone supported their work. Some criticized them for trying to bridge divides that seemed too wide to cross. Others dismissed their efforts as naive. But Chantel and Walter remained steadfast, knowing that even small steps toward understanding were worth taking. One crisp autumn afternoon, they returned to the park where it all began. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, and the air was cool but pleasant. Walter sipped from a thermos of coffee while Chantel munched on an apple she'd picked up from a nearby farmer's market. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Chantel asked, watching a group of children play tag in the distance. "All the time," Walter said. "But I also think about how far we still have to go." Chantel nodded. "It feels daunting sometimes. Like no matter how much we do, it'll never be enough." Walter leaned back, his gaze steady. "Maybe, but that's the thing about change. It's not about finishing the race. It's about making sure the people behind you have a better path to walk." Chantel smiled, her eyes glistening. "You always know what to say." Walter chuckled. "One of the perks of being old. You've had time to think about it." They sat in comfortable silence, the park alive with laughter and conversation. As the sun dipped lower, Chantel turned to Walter. "You've changed my life, you know," she said softly. Walter looked at her, his eyes kind but steady. "And you've changed mine. Funny how that works." When they finally stood, they walked side by side, their steps unhurried but purposeful. The path ahead was uncertain, but they faced it together, ready for whatever came next.